111 Deadliest Human Errors That Changed History Forever. Hook. The weight of a single mistake. What if one wrong decision could unravel an empire? What if a moment of arrogance, laziness, or blind confidence could send millions to their graves? Throughout history, the most catastrophic events on Earth were not caused by nature or fate. They were caused by people. By leaders who refused to listen. By scientists who ignored warnings. By soldiers who followed the wrong orders. By ordinary men and women who made extraordinary mistakes at the worst possible moment. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on 111 of the deadliest human errors that changed history forever. These are not small blunders. These are decisions that toppled kingdoms, ignited world wars, killed millions, and reshaped the map of civilization. Some of these names you will know. Some will shock you. All of them carry a warning that still applies today. Stay with us until the very end, because the last few errors on this list might be the most dangerous of all. And if this is your first time here, subscribe to this channel right now, because we bring you the kind of knowledge that history books are afraid to publish. Let us begin. The arrogance of certainty. The first category of deadly human error is the most common, and the most dangerous. It is the belief that you already know everything you need to know. History calls it arrogance. Psychology calls it overconfidence bias. The graves of empires call it the last thought before collapse. Napoleon Bonaparte marched 600,000 men into Russia in 1812 with absolute certainty of victory. He had never lost a major campaign. His generals were brilliant. His army was the finest in the world. But he underestimated the Russian winter, the scorched earth strategy of his enemies, and the sheer size of the land he was trying to conquer. By the time his army limped back to France, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The Grand Army of France, the most feared military force in Europe, was broken by pride. This is not an ancient lesson. It is an eternal one. Every generation produces leaders who believe they are the exception, that the rules of cause and effect do not apply to them. Every generation pays the price. The moment a person, an organization, or a nation stops asking "what if I am wrong?" it begins walking toward disaster. The Titanic, when safety was an afterthought. On April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank in under 3 hours. Over 1,500 people died in freezing water. The ship was called unsinkable, and that was precisely the problem. The Titanic received multiple iceberg warnings throughout that day. The wireless operators were overloaded with passenger messages and set at least one critical iceberg warning aside. The ship was traveling at near full speed in dangerous waters because the White Star Line wanted to make a record crossing. There were not enough lifeboats for everyone on board, not because of oversight, but because the designers believed they would not be needed. The Titanic disaster is not a story about icebergs. It is a story about what happens when human beings fall in love with their own creations so deeply that they stop questioning them. It is a story about warning signs that were ignored, shortcuts that were taken, and a culture of invincibility that cost thousands of lives. The error was not the iceberg. The error was the arrogance that got the ship within reach of it. Chernobyl, the night the atom turned on its masters. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded in what became the worst nuclear disaster in human history. The cause was not equipment failure alone. It was a series of human decisions made under pressure, in the dark, against every safety protocol that existed. Engineers were running a late-night safety test. The test had already been postponed multiple times. Supervisors pushed to complete it before a scheduled maintenance shutdown. Safety systems were deliberately disabled to run the test. When the reactor began behaving abnormally, operators pressed forward anyway, because stopping would mean admitting the test had failed, and no one wanted to be the one who failed. The explosion released 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 31 people died in the immediate aftermath. The long-term death toll from radiation-related illness runs into the thousands. An entire region of Ukraine remains uninhabitable to this day. Chernobyl teaches us that institutions can create cultures where speaking truth becomes dangerous and where admitting a problem becomes career suicide. In those cultures, the problem does not go away, it grows until it cannot be contained. The fall of Constantinople, a door left unlocked. In 1453, the great city of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, fortress of Christianity in the East, fell to the Ottoman forces of Sultan Mehmed II. The empire had stood for over 1,000 years. It fell because of a gate. During the siege, a small postern gate known as the Kirkaporta was left unlocked. Ottoman soldiers found it, poured through, and attacked the Byzantine defenders from within the walls. The city that had withstood sieges for centuries was taken in hours because someone forgot to lock a door. The lesson here is not that small things matter, though they do. The lesson is that great strength can be undone by a single neglected detail. Civilizations, relationships, businesses, and lives are often not destroyed by the enemy outside the walls. They are destroyed by the small, unguarded opening that was never taken seriously because everything else seemed so strong. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, against the Soviet Union. He was warned by his generals that it was too ambitious. He was warned that supply lines would not hold. He was warned about the Russian winter. He ignored every warning. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. He believed his ideology had made him immune to the same mistakes that had destroyed Napoleon. He was wrong on every count. The Eastern Front consumed the Nazi war machine. Over 27 million Soviet citizens died. Millions of German soldiers never came home. The decision to open a second front while already fighting Britain in the West is widely considered the single greatest military blunder of the Second World War, and it accelerated the destruction of the regime Hitler had built. The deadliest errors are often made by those who believe they have already learned from the past. The ignored warnings before Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 Americans and drawing the United States into World War II. What most people do not know is that the attack should not have been a surprise. American intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese diplomatic messages suggesting an imminent attack. A radar operator in Hawaii detected a large formation of aircraft approaching and reported it, and was told to ignore it, as it was assumed to be a group of American B-17 bombers expected that morning. A submarine had been detected and sunk outside the harbor hours before the attack, and the report was not escalated quickly enough. Pearl Harbor is a masterclass in the danger of assumption. Systems that are designed to detect danger can fail not because they stop working, but because the people watching them stop believing what the data is telling them. Warning systems without a culture of taking warnings seriously are just noise. The Black Death and the Cats. In medieval Europe, cats were widely associated with witchcraft and the devil. Pope Gregory IX, in the 13th century, declared cats, particularly black cats, to be instruments of Satan. As a result, cats were killed across Europe in massive numbers. Then came the Black Death. The bubonic plague arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by fleas on rats. Without cats to control the rat population, the rodents multiplied freely, spreading the disease through cities and villages at a devastating rate. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population, an estimated 25 million people. The elimination of cats did not directly cause the Black Death, but it removed one of nature's most effective barriers against the rats that carried it. This is a story about the danger of allowing fear, superstition, and ideology to override practical wisdom, and the catastrophic consequences that follow. The Great Leap Forward, Death by Policy. Between 1958 and 1962, Chinese leader Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, a campaign to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into a socialist industrial state. The policies he implemented led to one of the greatest human-made famines in history. Farmers were pulled from fields to work in backyard steel furnaces, producing useless, low-quality metal while crops rotted unharvested. Grain quotas were set impossibly high, and local officials, afraid to report failures to Beijing, falsified records, claiming massive harvests that did not exist. Food was exported while people starved. Dissent was punished. Truth was criminalized. Between 15 and 55 million people died. The exact number remains disputed, but there is no dispute about the cause. A system in which leaders could not hear the truth, and where admitting failure was more dangerous than allowing catastrophe. The thalidomide tragedy. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, thalidomide was prescribed across Europe and beyond as a safe treatment for morning sickness in pregnant women. It was marketed aggressively. It was described as one of the safest drugs ever developed. No one had tested it on pregnant animals. No one had studied its effects on developing fetuses. Between 10,000 and 20,000 babies were born with severe limb deformities. Thousands more were stillborn. One woman stood between thalidomide and American mothers, Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, who refused to approve the drug for American use because she believed the safety data was insufficient. Her refusal saved tens of thousands of American children. Thalidomide is a warning about the danger of rushing products, treatments, and systems to market before the full consequences are understood. It is also a reminder that one person with the courage to say this is not safe enough can change everything. The sinking of the Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. The sinking helped build American public opinion against Germany and contributed to the United States eventually entering World War I. What remains controversial is the question of what the Lusitania was carrying. Evidence suggests the ship was transporting war materials, ammunition and explosives, alongside its civilian passengers. The British Admiralty had been warned of U-boat activity in the area and had failed to reroute the ship or provide a naval escort. The dead were civilians who trusted that the ship they sailed on was safe. The error, whether deliberate, negligent, or both, cost nearly 1,200 lives and helped drag the world deeper into its first global war. The decision that started World War I. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo. What followed was not inevitable. What followed was a cascade of human decisions, each one defensive, each one escalatory, each one made by leaders who believed they were acting rationally, that pulled the entire world into the most destructive war it had ever seen. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia accepted most of it. Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. Russia began mobilizing in support of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France was pulled in by alliance. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war on Germany. Within 6 weeks of a single assassination, every major power in Europe was at war. The mechanisms of alliance, pride, and miscommunication had taken on a life of their own. No single leader intended a world war. Every single leader chose the actions that made one inevitable. World War I killed approximately 20 million people. It was not caused by monsters. It was caused by ordinary men making ordinary political calculations that spiraled beyond any of their control. The Space Shuttle Challenger. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch. All 7 crew members were killed. The cause was the failure of an O-ring seal in one of the solid rocket boosters, a failure that engineers had warned about before the launch. The night before Challenger lifted off, engineers at Morden Thiokol urgently recommended delaying the launch due to concerns about the O-ring's performance in cold temperatures. NASA managers overrode the recommendation. There was pressure to launch on schedule. There was pressure to prove that the space shuttle was reliable and operational. The engineers' warnings were treated as excessive caution. The O-ring failed exactly as the engineers predicted. The Challenger disaster became one of the most studied cases in organizational psychology, a perfect example of how institutional pressure can silence the voices most qualified to prevent a catastrophe. The lesson is not that warning signs are always right. The lesson is that warning signs deserve to be heard. The Dust Bowl. When farming broke the earth. In the 1930s, the Great Plains of the United States were turned into a wasteland. Millions of acres of grassland had been plowed up during the farming boom of the 1910s and 1920s, destroying the deep-rooted native grasses that held the soil in place. When drought came, there was nothing to hold the earth down. Massive dust storms, called black blizzards, rolled across the plains, burying farms and towns in darkness. Hundreds of thousands of people abandoned their homes and became refugees. The ecological damage took decades to partially recover. The human cost, in ruined lives, broken families, and shattered communities, was immeasurable. The Dust Bowl was not a natural disaster. It was the consequence of a farming culture that maximized short-term yield without understanding the long-term cost to the land. It was the consequence of human beings treating the earth as if it were an infinite resource, and learning, too late, that it was not subscribe, because this knowledge is power. Before we continue, let us pause here. If you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. Hit that subscribe button below this video. Ring the notification bell, because every week, we bring you exactly this kind of content. Deep, powerful, eye-opening knowledge drawn from the most important moments in human history. You will not find shallow content here. You will find wisdom, You will find stories that make you think differently about your own choices, your own decisions, and the world you are living in. This channel exists because history has lessons that every person alive today needs to hear. Do not miss a single one. Subscribe now. The Columbia disaster, a phone strike that was ignored. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. All 7 astronauts on board were killed. The cause was a piece of foam insulation that had broken off from the external tank during launch, striking the leading edge of the shuttle's left wing and creating a breach in the heat shield. NASA engineers had identified the foam strike during the mission and requested satellite imagery to assess the damage. The request was denied. Officials determined, without the requested imagery, that the damage was not a safety concern. They were wrong. Like Challenger before it, Columbia was a disaster shaped as much by organizational culture as by physics. The same patterns repeated. Warnings minimized, difficult questions discouraged, and a culture that prioritized schedule and optimism over rigorous safety analysis. Two shuttles, two disasters, the same human error at the root of both. The Rwandan genocide, when the world looked away. In 1994, in the small African nation of Rwanda, approximately 800,000 people, primarily Tutsi, were killed in 100 days. It was one of the fastest mass killings in recorded history, and it was allowed to happen while the world watched. The United Nations had peacekeeping troops in Rwanda. The force commander, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, sent a fax to UN headquarters in January 1994 warning of weapons caches and plans for mass killings. The response from the UN was to take no action and not to seize the weapons. When the genocide began, the international community failed to respond. Western nations evacuated their own citizens and withdrew. The UN peacekeepers were given orders not to intervene. The word, genocide, was deliberately avoided by governments because using it would have created a legal obligation to act. 800,000 people died while the mechanisms of international protection were paralyzed by bureaucracy, politics, and the unwillingness of powerful nations to accept the cost of intervention. The error was not ignorance. It was choice. The Irish famine, a political catastrophe disguised as nature. Between 1845 and 1852, a potato blight swept through Ireland, destroying the primary food source of the Irish peasant population. Over 1 million people died of starvation and related disease. Another million emigrated. Ireland's population fell by 25%. But the blight alone did not cause this catastrophe. Ireland, under British rule, continued to export food throughout the famine. Grain, livestock, and other crops were shipped out of the country while the Irish starved. British government policy, driven by ideology, racism, and a belief that market forces should be allowed to operate without interference, prevented adequate relief from reaching the dying. The famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was a human disaster, shaped by colonial policy, institutional indifference, and a political system that did not consider Irish lives worth protecting. It left a wound in Irish history that has never fully healed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the moral weight of a button. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city Hiroshima. On August 9, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Between 129,000 and 226,000 people died, the majority of them civilians. Japan surrendered days later, ending World War II in the Pacific. The decision to drop the bombs remains one of the most debated in human history. Those who defend it argue that it ended the war quickly and prevented an even more costly land invasion of Japan. Those who condemn it argue that Japan was already near surrender, that alternative options were not fully explored, and that the deliberate targeting of civilian populations constituted a war crime. Whatever position history ultimately takes, the atomic bombings forced humanity to confront a new reality, that human beings had built a weapon capable of ending civilization itself. The error, if it was one, was not merely strategic. It was the error of building something without fully reckoning with what it meant to use at the Aral Sea, the death of an ocean. In the 1960s, Soviet planners diverted the rivers feeding the Aral Sea in Central Asia to irrigate cotton fields in the desert. At the time, the Aral Sea was one of the 4 largest lakes in the world. Today, it is almost entirely gone, reduced to a fraction of its original size, leaving behind a toxic salt flat studded with the rusting hulks of fishing boats that were once sailing on open water. The fishing industry that supported millions of people was destroyed. The local climate changed. Toxic dust from the exposed seabed blew across the region, causing respiratory illness, cancer, and birth defects in the surrounding population. Communities that had existed for centuries were abandoned. The Aral Sea is one of the greatest environmental disasters in human history, and it was entirely man-made. It was caused by a system that valued short-term production targets over long-term ecological reality, and that never stopped to ask what would be lost. The flu of 1918, a war's deadliest weapon. The influenza pandemic of 1918, commonly known as the Spanish flu, killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. It remains one of the deadliest disease events in human history, and the conditions that allowed it to spread with such devastating speed were created by human error. Overcrowded trenches, military camps packed with malnourished soldiers, and the mass movement of troops across continents created the perfect breeding ground for the virus. Wartime censorship, particularly in countries like the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, suppressed reporting of the outbreak to avoid damaging morale. Spain, which was neutral and had no censorship, reported freely on the disease, which is why it was wrongly called the Spanish flu. By the time governments acknowledged the scale of the crisis, it was beyond control. Information suppressed in the name of wartime unity allowed the disease to spread unchecked. The error was not medical. It was political. It was the decision that telling the truth was too dangerous, and the price of that decision was tens of millions of lives. The Bay of Pigs, a plan built on wishful thinking. In April 1961, the CIA launched an invasion of Cuba using a force of Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the United States. The plan was designed to trigger a popular uprising against Fidel Castro. It was a catastrophic failure. Within 72 hours, the invaders had been captured or killed, and the United States had suffered one of the most embarrassing foreign policy defeats of the Cold War. The plan had fatal flaws that were identified before the invasion, and ignored. Intelligence estimates that assumed a popular uprising had no solid evidence base. The secrecy of the operation was so poorly maintained that it was widely known in advance. President Kennedy canceled crucial air strikes at the last moment, leaving the invaders without air support. The CIA never developed a credible fallback plan. The Bay of Pigs was the product of groupthink, a phenomenon where the pressure to conform within a decision-making group suppresses critical analysis. The people around the table wanted to believe the plan would work. And that desire to believe overrode the obligation to verify. The dams that drowned millions. In 1975, a series of dams in Henan Province, China, failed after extreme rainfall from Typhoon Nina. The Banqiao Dam, the largest, collapsed in the early hours of August 8, releasing a wall of water that swept through the valley below. It is estimated that between 85,000 and 240,000 people died in the flooding and subsequent famine and disease. The dams had been built with Soviet assistance in the 1950s and were considered state-of-the-art. Engineers had raised concerns about the safety of the design, concerns that were dismissed. When warnings were issued in the days before the disaster, floodgates were slow to open and evacuation orders were delayed. The Banqiao disaster remained largely unknown outside China for decades, suppressed by the Chinese government. It is one of the worst dam failures in history, and one of the most deliberately forgotten. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Doors that were locked. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the upper floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City. Of the 146 workers who died, most of them young immigrant women, many perished not because they could not find the fire exits, but because the exits were locked. Factory managers had locked the doors to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks and to stop union organizers from entering. When the fire broke out, workers who reached the stairwell doors found them locked from the outside. Dozens jumped from the windows rather than burn alive. The Triangle Fire is not simply a tragedy. It is a warning about what happens when human beings are treated as resources to be managed rather than lives to be protected. It is a warning about the consequences of power without accountability, and it directly led to the first major workplace safety reforms in American history. The Deepwater Horizon. When cutting corners costs everything. On April 20, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 workers and triggering the largest accidental marine oil spill in history. For 87 days, oil gushed into the Gulf at a rate of up to 62,000 barrels per day. Investigation after investigation found the same conclusion. The disaster was caused by a series of decisions in which safety was compromised in favor of speed and cost. Temporary cement used to seal the well was not properly tested. A key safety test was misread or ignored. Workers who raised concerns about well integrity were overruled. The well blowout was not an accident waiting to happen despite precautions. It was an accident waiting to happen because precautions were abandoned. BP paid over $65 billion in cleanup costs, fines, and legal settlements, vastly more than the cost of the safety measures that might have prevented the disaster entirely. The poisoning of Flint's water. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan switched its water supply to the Flint River as a cost-cutting measure. Officials failed to apply corrosion control treatments to the new water source, causing lead to leach from aging pipes into the drinking water of 100,000 residents. Doctors and residents raised alarms about the water almost immediately, noting discoloration, bad smell, and rashes. State and federal officials repeatedly dismissed the concerns and insisted the water was safe. Independent researchers who tested the water and found dangerous lead levels were discredited and attacked by government officials. Children in Flint were exposed to lead, a neurotoxin with no safe level of exposure, for over a year before the crisis was officially acknowledged. The damage to children's neurological development is permanent and irreversible. Flint is a story about what happens when the people responsible for protecting the public decide that protecting their reputation matters more. It is a story that is still unfolding today. Final reflections. What history demands of us. We have walked through 111 chapters of human error, from the locked doors of a factory in New York to the locked rooms of power where warnings were ignored, from the flooded plains of China to the poisoned pipes of an American city, from the arrogance of emperors to the groupthink of intelligence agencies. And what ties all of these stories together? Not evil, in most cases. Not stupidity. The most common thread running through every one of these disasters is something far more ordinary, and far more dangerous. It is the human tendency to believe that this time is different. That we are the exception. That the system will hold. That the warning is overstated. That someone else will catch it. History does not forgive that belief. History does not grade on a curve. The bill arrives, and it is always paid, not by the people who made the decisions, but by the people who had no say in them. The question history puts to every generation is not "Did you mean well?" The question is, "Did you act wisely? Did you listen? Did you ask hard questions? Did you protect the people who had no one else protecting them?" That is what these 111 errors demand we ask of ourselves. Not as judgment, but as preparation. The next error is already being made somewhere in the world, right now. The next warning is already being filed away, unopened. The next disaster is in its early stages, still small enough to stop. The only thing that changes the outcome is people who have learned enough from the past to see it coming. Be one of those people. Call to action. Join this community. If this video moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know before, then you already understand why this channel exists. We are building a community of thinkers, learners, and people who refuse to sleepwalk through history. Every week, we go deep into the moments, the minds, and the mistakes that shape the world you are living in right now. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling us which of these 111 errors shocked you the most. This is more than a YouTube channel. This is a school, and the lessons are free, but the knowledge is priceless. We will see you in the next one.